today's mindful moment. We always hear that bookstores are kind of on their way out, becoming like a relic of the past as everything goes digital.
Right, this idea of bookstores fading away.
Yeah, but what if that's just not true, like at all?
Mm,
Like what if the whole story of bookstores in America isn't about them disappearing, but actually it's about them changing and adapting over centuries?
that's a really interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, so instead of assuming bookstores are doomed, we're going to do a deep dive. We've got all these fascinating sources, stuff from way back in colonial times, stories from booksellers from then and now.
Plus, we'll look at how the whole book industry has been changing.
Exactly. And the goal for you listening is to see past the simple story and discover how tough and important bookstores have actually been.
And still are, yeah. Get ready to have your mind blown a little bit.
Seriously. So let's go way back to the beginning, back to colonial America. You might think there's always been bookstores in the U.S.,
It feels that way, right?
but back then, it was a totally different scene. In the late 1600s, most people in the colonies, like two-thirds of them, didn't own any books at all.
Wow, so books were pretty rare.
Super rare. And even if you did have some, it was probably a tiny collection, mainly religious stuff. It wasn't like today where we have easy access to tons of books.
So how did the earliest booksellers even manage in a world with so few books? It couldn't have been a very big business.
Right. They had to be super creative. Like there was this guy, Hezekiah Usher in Boston, one of the first booksellers. He didn't just sell books and pamphlets. He also sold sugar and wine.
Wait, sugar, wine, and books? That's a weird combo.
I know, right? But think about it. There weren't enough people buying books to keep him afloat, so he had to diversify, sell other things and make a living.
So books weren't really their own industry yet.
Yeah.
Makes sense. But were there any early bookstores that were, more focused on books and literature, kind of like what we think of today?
There were actually. This guy, Benjamin Harris, also in Boston. He had a print shop that was also a bookstore. And get this, he added a coffee house to the mix.
A coffee house in a bookstore.
Yeah, on King Street in Boston. It's like one of the first bookstore cafes in America. People would hang out there, have a drink, and talk about the books. And also all the hot political and religious topics of the day.
Wow, so a 17th century version of what we see today, bookstores as places to meet and chat. But, okay, so let's say you walk into one of these early bookstores. What's it like? Could you just browse around like we do now?
Nope, not really. For a long time, even into the 1800s, they kept most of the books behind counters or locked up in cabinets. And they were organized by publisher, not by subject or author.
Oh, so you couldn't just wander around and see what caught your eye.
Exactly. You had to know exactly what you wanted and then ask for it. The browsing experience we take for granted, like discovering a cool new book by chance, that didn't really exist back then.
That's so different from today. So when did that change? When did browsing become a thing?
The old corner bookstore in Boston was a big turning point. By the mid-1800s, it was this huge bookstore and publisher. And what made them different was that they actually encouraged browsing.
Like they wanted people to just look around.
Yeah, they had display tables, books out on shelves. You could walk around and pick things up.
That seems so simple, but it must have been a big deal.
Oh, it was revolutionary. Because when people could browse, they spent more time in the store, and that led to more conversations, between customers and with the booksellers themselves. The old corner even had a coffee shop right next door, owned by this woman, Mrs. Haven. It became a hangout spot for writers, editors, literary critics, like Longfellow even went there.
So it wasn't just buying books, it was about creating a whole literary community.
Totally. And as America grew, bookstores started trying out all kinds of different models, finding new ways to connect with readers. One big development was bookstores popping up inside department stores.
Oh, yeah, like in those massive stores.
Yep. In the late 1800s, you had places like A.T. Stewart's in New York, and this really impressive one, Marshall Field's in Chicago.
I can only imagine how big their book section must have been.
It was huge. This woman, Marcella Honor, ran it, and she turned it into one of the best bookstores in the country. It wasn't just about having a ton of books. She did all these cool things like author talks with famous writers like Carl Sandburg and Gertrude Stein, and she even had these fancy publisher exhibits right there in the department stores, like a destination.
Wow, that's amazing. But what about people who didn't live in big cities? How did they get access to books?
That's where these traveling booksellers come in, these really romantic figures. In the 1920s, you had things like the Caravan Bookshop, basically a bookstore on wheels. It was this truck with awnings that traveled all over New England.
A bookstore on wheels, that's so cool.
Right. And there was Frank Shea's Parnassus on Wheels, which was inspired by a novel. They would go to summer vacation spots in small towns, bringing books to people who didn't have a bookstore nearby.
It sounds idyllic, but I bet it was tough work.
Oh, it was. Long hours on the road, never knowing how many people would show up, the truck and the books getting beat up, and if it rained, forget about it. No one's buying books in the rain. Plus, they had to compete with any local bookstores.
So many challenges. It's fascinating to see all these different approaches to getting books into people's hands. You had the established bookstores, the giant department stores, and these mobile bookstores. What about bookstores that tried to do things differently, push boundaries with the kinds of books they sold or their whole mission?
In the early 1900s, some really innovative bookstores popped up,
Mm-hmm.
like the Sunwise Turn in New York. They didn't just want to sell books, they wanted to create a whole art experience, guiding people towards certain kinds of books and art, and promoting intellectual conversations.
So it was like a curated experience.
Exactly. And they were really important for the Women's National Book Association. They held some of their early meetings there.
So bookstores were also becoming hubs for professional and social networks.
Absolutely. But while all this was going on, another big change was happening. Discount bookstores started becoming a thing, like Barnes& and Noble and Croce's and Brentanos. They sold mostly paperbacks, which made books cheaper and accessible to more people.
That must have shaken things up a bit.
For sure. Some people, like Frances Steloff, who owned the famous Gotham Book Mart, she didn't want to sell paperbacks at first. She thought books should be these precious collectible objects.
So there was this conflict between making books more accessible and this more traditional view of books.
Exactly, and that tension still exists today. This whole evolution of how we get and understand literature, like finding the meaning in it, it reminds me of this YouTube channel called Mindful Moments.
Oh, I've heard of that.
They use AI to analyze audiobooks and then give you these really cool, concise summaries so you get the key ideas. It's like a modern way of finding insights, kind of like what we're doing with the history of bookstores.
That's a neat connection. But despite all these changes, these huge bookstore chains, independent bookstores haven't gone away. In fact, it seems like they're making a comeback. Why do you think that is?
It's interesting, right? I think it's because they're doing a few things really well. They're focusing on what made those early community bookstores so special, but they're also adapting to how things are today.
Hmm.
Like, take Three Lives and Company in New York. They don't have a coffee shop. They're not super active on social media. They don't even host a ton of events.
That's going against the grain.
Totally. But they're thriving because they have this amazing selection of books and their staff is so knowledgeable, they genuinely connect with their customers.
So it's about that personal touch, building relationships with people.
Exactly. It's like when you go there, they know you, they remember what you like to read, they even ask about your family. You don't get that online. There are these regulars like Abel, who's always sitting on the stool, and Camille, who remembers everyone's reading tastes. It creates this sense of community that you can't get from clicking add to cart.
It makes sense. And some independent bookstores, they focus on really specific types of books, or they're located in these unexpected places, and somehow it works.
Totally. Like Brown's Bookstore in Chicago was originally designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, the famous architect, and it was on the 7th floor of an art building. Can you imagine?
Wow, that's a statement.
Right. Eventually moved to the ground floor, but the fact that it was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright shows you how important bookstores were considered, even back then. And then there's this place, Exile, in Bookville. It's on the 2nd floor of a building, and you have to kind of seek it out, but people love it.
It's like a hidden gem for serious book lovers. And some bookstores become known for their unique focus, like supporting specific writers or communities.
The Gotham Book Mart, owned by Frances Steloff, is a great example. It became a hub for all these groundbreaking writers, people like H.L. Mencken and Henry Miller. Steloff was all about supporting writers, especially new talent, and she even fought against censorship.
So it was like a literary salon, a place where ideas could flow freely.
Exactly. And then you have bookstores that were created to support specific communities or causes, like Drum and Spear in D.C., which opened in the late 1960s. Their mission was to promote Black literature and culture, and they hosted events with writers like Gwendolyn Brooks and celebrated Black history.
It shows how bookstores can be deeply connected to the social and political landscape.
Totally. Their role can shift depending on what's happening in the world around them. But what about those booksellers you see out on the sidewalks, especially in cities?
Yeah, those pop-up bookstalls, they're interesting. They have this long history, especially in places like New York. It's not always easy for them, with all the city regulations and everything. But they're important because they bring books to people who might not go into a traditional bookstore.
It's true. They're like these little mobile literary outposts popping up where you least expect them. It's a reminder that people still crave that connection with books, even in the middle of a busy city. But of course, we can't talk about bookstores today without talking about Amazon. What happened when they came onto the scene?
Amazon definitely changed the game. Early on, people like Len Riggio from Barnes& Noble, they saw that Amazon could disrupt the whole industry.
And they tried to buy Amazon, right?
Yeah, but it didn't work out. Amazon's strategy was all about growing really fast, even if they didn't make a ton of money at first. They offered big discounts and built this massive online store, and that put a lot of pressure on physical bookstores.
So how did bookstores adapt to this digital takeover?
In all kinds of ways. Some bookstores partnered with Amazon, some fought back, and some tried to find their own niche. And then Amazon even opened their own physical bookstores.
Which seems kind of ironic, right?
It is, right. Some independent bookstore owners went to check them out and said they were efficient, but kind of soulless. They didn't have that personal touch. The American Booksellers Association launched this campaign called #BoxedOut to highlight the difference between buying online and the experience you get in a real bookstore.
It's like this battle between the giant online retailer and these smaller independent bookstores.
It is, and it's amazing how resilient the independent bookstores have been. Some people call it a novel resurgence. New independent bookstores keep opening, and they're finding ways to thrive. Like Ann Patchett's bookstore, Parnassus Books in Nashville. They focus on events, author signings, and really being a part of the community. They're showing that bookstores aren't going anywhere.
It's really inspiring to see that. So the story of bookstores in America isn't about decline. It's about constant adaptation and reinvention. They face so many challenges, from technology to economics, but they're still here, often in these surprising and innovative ways.
Absolutely. It's a testament to their enduring power.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of bookstores, here's something to think about. The next time you need a book, pause for a moment and consider what will influence your decision about where to buy it. What does that choice say about the role you think bookstores play in your community and in our culture?
It's a good question to reflect on.
It really is. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to subscribe for more fascinating discussions. And share this episode with anyone you know who loves books or history.
We'd love for more people to join the conversation.
And if you want to learn even more about this topic, we'll include a link in the show notes where you can buy the Bookshop, one of the books we used for this episode. But most importantly, keep thinking critically about how we access stories and knowledge.
Because it shapes our understanding of the world around us.
Exactly.
Thanks for listening.
Until next time. And for more mind-blowing content, don't forget to check out Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go. Mindful Moments is full of bite-sized episodes like mini deep dives into science, philosophy, history, and art.
It's perfect for keeping your mind active while on the go.